Dear Rector, dear Vice Rector, dear colleagues, dear Professor Peters and family, welcome to the ceremony for the award of an honorary doctorate to Professor Anne Peters. I will not introduce her to you, I don't have to, either because you know her or because we will have an extensive laudatio where you will get to know all the details. But perhaps I can say a few words about the process leading up to this honorary doctorate. As a faculty, we are in fact blessed because, with many thanks to the rector, we were allowed in recent years to award 2 honorary doctorates, whereas all other faculties only have 1. In 2023, we awarded, as you may remember, an honorary doctorate to Amal Clooney, the human rights activist on our and now we got the honor to choose someone for an honorary doctorate to celebrate 600 years of KU Leuven. And as soon as we had that good news, we assembled a committee of wise persons and we launched a call in the faculty. And we said we are looking for somebody of the highest standing, academic and or otherwise. And in this case, as you will hear, it is both academic and otherwise. But also for someone who really stands for the values that as a university and as a faculty we want to defend, and someone who has enough idealism to actually live and fight for these ideals. And the committee, after considering many proposals of great value, unanimously decided that we should go for an honorary doctorate for you, Professor Peters, for all the reasons that you will get to know when you hear the laudatio. And then it was actually very easy to convince the faculty and to convince the group, humanities, and to convince the university that this was indeed the best possible choice. And then it was my pleasant task as dean to contact Professor Peters and ask her whether she would actually accept our nomination. And not unexpectedly, but still very pleasant, I met not with a prima donna, but with a very kind, very enthusiastic, very driven, but also informal, modest person. And yeah, you immediately accept it. And you are not the kind of honorary doctor who flies in and out just to collect the degree. Quite the opposite, I would say. Because then we asked, yeah, could you perhaps, for our students and our researchers and for us, also have a fireside chat before the ceremony? And you immediately said yes. And then we said, yeah, could you perhaps maybe also come an entire week in November to teach our students in our global law program? And again, you immediately said yes. And this very much proves that you are not here for yourself, you're here for the community at large, you are here to teach us, to inspire us, and we are so very grateful that you accepted the nomination and everything that came with it. So thank you on behalf of the faculty for being here, and I will immediately now invite my colleague Randall de Saffer to give us the laudatio. Please.
Honorable Rector, dear Professor Peters, dear Dr. Heiner Schwelke, dear Dr. Johannes Schwelke, dear Dr. Julia Pieker, Madam Vice Rector, dear Dean de Vroe, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. After the end of the Cold War, international law went through a period of tremendous change and expansion. It saw the growth of its body mass of rules, the emergence of new regulatory and dispute settlement institutions, and the general rise of its impact on the daily interactions of states, non-state agents, and ultimately individuals at the international level. During this period, international law has both been a carrier and a beneficiary of globalization and of the spreading of what is often called a liberal world order. For that, it has been lauded as well as upbraided. Many have embraced international law as an instrument of human dignity, of democracy, peace, and in more recent years, sustainability. Others have been more critical of these universalist aspirations, seeing them in a dog tongue, a lever of power for the West, a force to impose cultural hegemony, and perhaps both have their voices. It may be true that international law often functions as an instrument of the powerful, but that only ever covers part of reality. International law, like any law, ought also to have another opposite aspiration, which stands at the core of its commitment to human dignity. That is, to use the words once spoken by our very own rector, Luc Sels, at the graduation ceremony for law students. He may not remember them, or he may with his wonderful memory, that, I quote in an English translation, "Law makes the weak stronger," end of quote. In a field of law that lacks a sovereign legislature and has, regardless of recent growth, altogether only a thin layer of authoritative case law, scholarship retains a remarkable significant role in the articulation of international law and in fostering consent about what it is. Since international law first became an established academic and professional discipline some 150 years ago, in every generation great scholars have stood out who have given international law coherence as a value-based system of law and through it contributed to its authority. In her generation, Anne Peters is one of the foremost representatives of that tradition. Her career coincides with the post-Cold War era. After having studied law as well as Greek and Spanish in Würzburg, Freiburg, and Lausanne, and after having done her national bar exam, Anne Peters obtained her PhD in law in 1994 from the University of Freiburg on a study on the use of referenda in territorial settlements. 6 years later, with in between an LLM at Harvard, she successfully finished her habilitation at the University of Kiel on European constitutional theory. Already there we see the two main strains that define her scholarship, a mastery of doctrinal international law in combination with fundamental constitutional thinking and theory. Shortly after her graduation at Kiel, she received a call to the chair of public international law and Swiss constitutional law at Basel, where she remained a full professor until 2013, when she became director at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law at Heidelberg, one of the world's intellectual powerhouses in international law. She also holds part-time positions at Basel, Heidelberg, the Freie Universität Berlin, and Michigan. Her practice in consultancy includes representing her country at the International Court of Justice, a membership of the Venice Commission for Democracy Through Law, the German Council for International Law, and the Hague Permanent Court of Arbitration. Over the past 30 years, Anne Peters has written and published an enormous mass of high-quality scholarly work on international law, human rights, European constitutionalism, constitutional law. Her work not only catches and spearheads the dramatic changes international law has undergone and is undergoing, but gives it a forward impetus. She has time and again marched at the front of fundamental debates about the direction and the aspirations of international law. I refer to, among many others, her book with Jan Klabbers on global constitutionalism, her book on the individual as a subject of international law, and her book on the rights of animals in the context of sustainability. The strength and the significance of her scholarly work and intervention in global academic debates is triple. Firstly, in a field that has enormously expanded, but in the process has also seen the splitting off by new subdisciplines such as international human rights law, the law of international organizations, international criminal or international environmental law, global administrative law, and the like, Anne Peters, while being active of several of these subfields, remains a rare generalist, whose work, taking general principles as a point of departure, safeguards the coherence of international law, and thus underpins its authority as an instrument of global governance and fairness. Rather than a set of isolated specialisms, under her pen, international law remains a unified discourse and system from which its many actors and institutions can draw strength. Secondly, during this period of growth of international law, its academic study, which has traditionally been strongly practice-oriented, has somewhat become disaggregated through the turn to theory and to history by a large part of the crowd. Sorry about that. Anne Peters' work transcends this divide between theory and practice. Seemingly doctrinal in nature, her more fundamental interventions rest on strong theoretical and historical foundations. Her work on individual rights in international law illustrates this well. While many a great theoretician of international law has argued for displacing the state by the individual at the foundations of international law, Anne Peters has excavated existing law for finding the spots where the individual already holds a place and for indicating the concrete levers that rules, procedures, and institutions offer for enhancing the agenda of human dignity and self-determination from within the existing framework. In doing so, she both engages with current international law developments and with conceptual fundamental questions which are indispensable to the production of useful knowledge. There immediately lies the third strength of her work. In her view, international law is more than a technical form of global governance. It's also a program for social change, and above all, for the protection of dignity and self-determination and of those who are most in need. I here say dignity and not human dignity, because her perspective does not limit itself to one single living species, but to all life on Earth. In the 10 years, she and I worked together at the editorial board of the Journal of the History of International Law, and yes, Anne, we sometimes had fun, but also some quite hard nuts to crack in this small but thriving field that does not give the lie to Kissinger's saying that in academia the fights are bitter because the stakes are low. In those 10 years, I learned to know Anne as a person who combines high moral principle with courage and compassion. I know, Anne, you had several times during these hard times said that you admired my diplomacy. You were far too nice to speak about pragmatism or even opportunism. And I did not want to spoil my moment in your bright sun by saying that I admired your moral courage. But I'm saying it now, particularly as this is a quality we're all going to need in the coming years more than ever. Anne Peters is somebody who will always stand up for those who are most in need and mobilize the great resources of her mind, her energy, and her compassion for those. As an academic leader, she's an example of excellent espouse to openness and humility. As I read it, I realize, Dr. Schwelke, that's interpretable in more than one way. An inspiration to many, whatever their background. That leadership is intellectual, but it's also institutional, with Anne devoting countless hours to build scholarly institutions for the next generation, such as in her roles as a former president of the German and the European Societies of International Law. Before I move towards a conclusion, I want to add that Anne Peters has also been a prime mover in the boom in the history of international law, and is becoming an established and organized field of study. Anne Peters will often say, with sincere but nevertheless unjustified modesty, that she is not a historian of international law herself. While there are some excellent publications that show the opposite, her main role has been that of a facilitator and a grammarian of the field. With the Oxford Handbook of the History of International Law, she has pioneered a true turn to the globalization of the field, while under her leadership, the Journal of the History of International Law has become an engine of open conversation in an ever-extending community. Gleider Hernandez, who's very sorry he can't be here because of his obligations as current president of the European Society of International Law. Inge van Hulle and Wouter Druet, who with me proposed Anne for an honorary doctorate from our Faculty of Law and Criminology, are thrilled that the Faculty Board and Council, the group and the Academic Council of the University endorsed this proposal. And I, for one, consider it as one of the great honors of my career that I'm allowed to give this laudatio to you. In recent years, international law has been facing a headwind, which in the past 2 months has turned into a vicious storm. But although we may be blown off course, it's far too soon to abandon ship. International law, which more maybe than any other branch of law often finds itself at the vanishing point where law meets raw power, is made to be resilient and to absorb shocks. As with all law, its rules, procedures, and institutions are made to manage disputes by constraining contention through principle. That also means that although justice is blind, in that it tries to be fair, it can never be neutral. It needs the strength of moral conviction. The power of our current international law rests, or must rest at least, in the fact that it is grounded on each person's dignity and self-determination. This current crisis of the rule of law in the world order makes it a very appropriate time for all, which have survived so many storms in their 600 years history, to give testimony to their unshakable belief in the power of international law in particular, and law in general, as instruments of global justice. We do this by awarding an honorary doctorate to somebody who over the past decades has been constantly in the vanguard of advancing international law in the service of justice and fairness for all. Through her outstanding academic work, through her profound legal wisdom, through her firm moral rectitude, and through her courage, Anne Peters can help us to look beyond the storm, and in the meantime put up a fight, when and where we can, for the rule of law in this, our global village. Om al deze redenen, meneer de rector, verzoek ik u op voordracht van de Academische Raad het eredoctoraat van KU Leuven te verlenen aan professor Anne Peters.
Professor Anne Peters, KU Leuven is honoring you for your extraordinary contribution as a scholar to the coherence, history, and authority of international law as an instrument of global governance and justice in times of great change and turmoil, for giving a central place to all human persons and their rights, and especially those most in need, and for fostering the causes of democracy, the rule of law, peace, social justice, global sustainability, and human dignity. For your inspirational role as an academic leader and mentor, building institutions and networks, and your generous, collaborative, and humanistic spirit. For setting an example to future generations of scholars for academic rigor, honesty, courage, openness, and inclusion. For these reasons, I hereby bestow upon you, in my capacity as rector of KU Leuven, and upon the recommendation of the Academic Council, the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa of this university. My congratulations.
Oh, first we sign the Book of Honor. Many thanks to the Desquin Quartet, playing at major international events, founded in 2017 at the Antwerp Conservatory, and of course even more famous now that they have played at the Honorary Doctorate of Professor Peters. Ladies and gentlemen, it has happened. We have a new and magnificent honorary doctor to be proud of as a university and as a faculty. And I now invite you, Honorary Dr. Peters, to give us your lecture, please. The arrows.
Honorable Rector, Madame Vice-Rector, dear Dean, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. The University of Leuven, celebrating its 600th anniversary, is older than international law. Leuven was founded 223 years before the Peace of Westphalia, a symbolic marker of the alleged birth of international law. All the more humbled and immensely grateful I am that the university celebrating its birthday has honored me with such a gift. In my talk today, I will first, under heading A, examine how the international legal order is stirred nowadays. Under B, I will examine countertrends that work in favor of international law and where international law seems alive and kicking. Under C, I will venture an assessment, and I will conclude with some words on the possible role of us, legal scholars, in these turbulent times. The past years were marked by shocks: the Russian invasion into Ukraine, Hamas attacks on Israel with more than 1,300 victims and hostages, and ensuing horrible destruction and killing of more than 50,000 Palestinians by Israeli forces, and then the inauguration of Trump as the US-American president. What are the effects of these shocks for the international legal order? The current assessments differ. Is international law damaged beyond repair? Or, commenting on the sanctions against the International Criminal Court, the president of the American Society of International Law wrote that modern international legal order is now under direct assault. Or is it just much ado about nothing, as the South African colleague Dire Tladi, before joining as a judge the International Court of Justice, analyzed the Trump 1.0 administration? In any case, we need to put the current stirs of the international legal order in historical perspective. For example, international law seems much more refined and also more operational than before 1989, when the world was split into two fixed blocks. It's therefore crucially important to study international law and history, as our colleague Randall Lussafer, who truly bridges both disciplines. So let's look at the recent events in relation to international law. First, we see measures that are in themselves lawful, but nevertheless potentially erode the international legal order and the international rule of law. The rising number of populist governments in the world are excellent in performance politics without a direct legal effect. An example is Trump's renaming the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. A rising number of states sees especially open borders as a threat. The result is the re-emergence of the fenced and walled territorial nation state protected by security guards and by tariffs. Building walls is of course not unlawful per se, but the border measures are typically accompanied by violations of non-refoulement and human rights, including the prohibition of mass expulsions. International law has also been used proactively to reach goals that ultimately are against the spirit of international law. An example is the Italian-Albanian Treaty on Asylum Centers on Albanian territory. Italian commentators have analyzed this treaty to be completely useless. Or the selective defunding of some activities is also not unlawful, but it has potentially detrimental effects on world order. Another trend is exit. Exit from international organizations and international treaties, such as Turkey, exited from the Istanbul Convention, the United States from the Paris Agreement. 4 African states have unsigned the protocol to the African Court on Human and People's Rights since 2016. Israel left the Human Rights Council, and I could go on and on. In all this, we see often legalistic, even Byzantine uses of the law. For example, in the US-American walkout from the World Health Organization, President Trump did this in form of an invalidation of the retraction of the first withdrawal from the organization. In the first Trump administration, Trump had in 2020 notified withdrawal of the US from the WHO, but then President Biden had in January 21 retracted Trump's notice of withdrawal, and now the 2025 invalidation of Biden's retraction serves Trump better than a new withdrawal because the period of notice will not start freshly and because the president won't need the consent of the Senate. The increasing number of populist leaders all over the world don't like courts. They attack both domestic and international courts for the same reason, namely that these are counter-majoritarian institutions. But the fact that judges are not only unelected, but on top foreign, adds insult to injury in the eyes of populist governments. Populists can undermine domestic courts, notably by court packing, as elaborately practiced in Poland, Hungary, and in the United States. Such court packing is, of course, not available as a strategy against international courts and tribunals. And therefore, other options are withdrawal. For example, Bolivia withdrew from the International Center on the Settlement of Investment Disputes in 2007. The Philippines withdrew from the International Criminal Court in 2018 because of the investigation against then-President Duterte. The new government of the Philippines now arrested and transferred Duterte to the ICC last week. So this is an illustration of international law not being able to work against politics, but when the political tides change, it can be reactivated. But the International Criminal Court can also be instrumentalized. Another form of opposition is unlawful non-compliance. For example, Russia, after a Constitutional Court judgment of 2016, refused, I quote the court, to follow literally a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in the event of its execution contradicts constitutional values, said the Constitutional Court of Russia. This was until Russia was expelled in 2022 from the Council of Europe. The third type of backlash against international courts are sanctions by non-member states. An example is the recent US sanction against the International Criminal Court with asset freezes and entry bans. The Trumpish sanctions against the International Criminal Court have been deplored by a statement of 79 of the 125 state parties to that court. Their joint statement says, and I quote the statement, "Such measures threaten to erode the international rule of law." But the joint statement does not condemn them as unlawful per se. Or the recent Israeli entry to Israel bill proposes to extend a prohibition on entry permits for individuals who support prosecution by Israeli leaders by the international criminal courts. I would like to conclude on courts saying that not all international courts are equally suspect. Left-wing governments deplore the unelected international arbitrators to decide in favor of foreign investors. Right-wing governments decry the unelected human rights courts judges who decide in favor of migrants, prisoners, and LGBTQ persons. And left and right governments like to use the International Criminal Court against the political opponents, for example, against their own country's defeated prior government. But they defy the court when it wants to prosecute friends. The next type of pushback against international law are occasional and isolated violations. Isolated breaches, of course, leave the law in place as a matter of principle. As the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua case of 1986 famously pointed out, that even the prohibition of the use of force can be honored in the breach. Because the United States had defended its conduct by appealing to exceptions or justifications, the effect was, said the court, to confirm rather than to weaken the rule. A current example of such, so to speak, normal violations of international law might be the US mismanagement of the avian flu that potentially violates World Health Organization's international health regulations, or the US-American military strikes against the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea of last week. Or this week, it's going so fast. Under international law, such conduct is not immediately recognizable as unlawful, but it is often in a gray zone, even over long periods. But where an international body is competent, it can settle such question and establish a quite clear breach. For example, the International Criminal Court has in several cases recently at the occasion of Putin's visit to Mongolia, decided that state parties are obliged to transfer also heads of state of a non-party state because their immunity is not opposable to the International Criminal Court. This would also apply to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. In contrast now to the everyday and normal violations of international law stands what Christian Marxen has called systemic opposition. And this might make the current situation novel. Such systemic opposition is, so to speak, a revolution from the inside. One strategy is the distortion of facts so that they lead to a wrong legal assessment. Putin's denial of the presence of Russian soldiers in Crimea in the spring of 2014 has become infamous, and the press spoke of little green men. The new US-American stance towards the Russian aggression is also not much better. In a press conference, Trump said, with regard to Ukraine, that was not a good war to go into. Of course, not all lying fits under the heading systemic opposition. In war, the truth is one of the first victims, it is said, and small lies are, of course, part of everyday life. However, systemic, grand lying on basically every fact that informs political decision-making, ranging from migrants eating cats and dogs to lying with a factor 10 on the US military aid given to Ukraine, this amounts to a paradigm change. It's a change from the paradigm of good faith endeavors to a paradigm of corruption. And this seems to have a systemic, a sapping effect on legal order. Second, violations with obviously sham legal explanations can amount to systemic opposition. I would count the US-American tariffs in violation of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement here. Besides being what the Wall Street called the dumbest trade war in history, Trump's invocation of a national emergency due to opioid influx obviously does not justify the tariffs. This argument does not pass what the famous international legal scholar Tom Frank called the laugh test. Similarly, the Russian claims accompanying its aggression against Ukraine constitute a systemic opposition, especially the principal claim, the assertion that Russia acts in self-defense, is off the mark, because no armed attack against Russia was in sight. The Russian claims have been termed as, I quote, demonstrably rubbish justifications. They were a mere cynical employment of words to veil a blatantly unlawful conduct. And because of these obvious flaws in the argumentation, the Russian stance might manifest the state's turn against the existing international legal order. Arguably, Russia has here implicitly advocated an international order no longer based on state sovereignty, equality of states. If accepted, the new order would be a Großraumordnung, in the sense of Carl Schmitt, a theory of the greater space. Initially, both a scholarly and an interstate consensus against Russia's legal claims quickly consolidated. However, the solid state majority condemning the aggression in the UN General Assembly is constantly shrinking. And the most recent General Assembly resolution on the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion, which calls out the invasion and which reaffirms that no territorial acquisition resulting from threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal, this recent resolution of 25th February garnered only 93 plus 65, that is 158 pro or neutral votes out of 193 UN member states, and most shockingly, the USA also voted against this resolution. The outcome may well be that Russia's, what I call systemic opposition to the international legal order, will be crowned with success. The lines between an ordinary violation, which might honor the rule in the breach, and systemic opposition against the international legal order as a whole are, of course, blurry. Take the example of Gaza. The massacre of Hamas amounted to an armed attack by a non-state actor, which arguably triggers the right to self-defense, but even that is not entirely uncontroversial. And even if in self-defense, the casualties of over 50,000 people in Gaza, over 70% women and children, and the complete destruction of the infrastructure was probably disproportionate. A recent report of the UN Human Rights Council also found violations of international humanitarian law and crimes against humanity. And the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrants based on a reasonable ground to believe that Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of Israel are responsible for a crime against humanity in the form of starvation. All this is highly controversial and contested. The final legal assessment will depend on the quality of the legal arguments. Now, critical legal scholars have argued that it is impossible to distinguish a proper legal argument from a merely cynical use of an international law vocabulary. I would rather say that there are better or worse arguments and answers within the parameters of the legal discourse. I would also say that the better answer is not inevitably and not only politics in disguise, but can be a specifically legal answer. But the struggle and disagreement about the range of admissible legal answers may take a long time. And of course, even capricious legal arguments fulfill one legal job. They confirm that law is the language of states. And this is therefore that a third type of behavior becomes very important, walking out from the international legal arena. President Trump mainly passes over in silence international law in basically all his moves, announcing to establish a Gaza Riviera without any reference to the international law on self-determination. Similar thing with regard to taking over the Panama Canal or Greenland. In his joint address to Congress, Trump said, on Greenland, and I think we're going to get it, one way or the other, we're going to get it, end of quote. Without mentioning non-intervention, sovereignty over natural resources, or self-determination. Also, the United Nations Security Council resolution of 24th February, with the votes of Russia and the USA, and the abstention of all European states, and no veto by France and UK, this resolution does not mention any Russian aggression, but simply speaks of the Russian Federation-Ukraine conflict. The resolution refers to the principal purpose of the United Nations as expressed in the Charter. However, the resolution only selectively reiterates Charter language. Article 1 of the United Nations Charter establishes as one purpose of the organization the settlement of international disputes. I quote the Charter, in conformity with the principles of justice and international law. But the recent Security Council resolution only mentions peace and security, leaving out international law and justice. The ambassador of Panama rightly stated that this resolution sounds more eloquently than its words. So far, I've told a story of recent attacks on international law, but there are also contrary trends, and there's the story of resistance. Generally speaking, international law seems to work in some respects. States are still cooperating. For example, in 2023, a multilateral treaty on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction was concluded. We see intense treaty making in the field of criminal cooperation. States have recently re-acceded international treaties. For example, Ecuador returned to the Investor State Dispute Convention after having quit. So what Jan Wouters has called the stagnation of multilateral treaty making is not complete, let's say. The next much noted phenomenon is the rush to international courts, first of all to the International Court of Justice. The docket here is spiking with so-called mega politics being made at the court. States from all regions of the world are suing, and this phenomenon has even been called public interest litigation. Examples are, of course, the climate various proceedings revolving around genocide. Plaintiff states like Gambia, South Africa, or Nicaragua, they are not themselves the victims, but they claim to act in the global public interest when they invoke erga omnes norms. The South African complaint against Israel and the provisional measures ordered by the court have been celebrated as a victory of the global South. But of course, seizing the court is always also a political move. Gleide Hernandez described it as strategic litigation with only a veneer of community interests. Still, the mere fact that such litigation might have political, even base motives, doesn't necessarily mean that the legal arguments will be frivolous. Such a lawsuit may still contribute to a welcome clarification and possibly development of the law on difficult questions. And a sign is that a massive number of states have been intervening in these proceedings, which clearly shows their legal interests and stakes in these cases. So indeed, as Hernandez comments, the various claims do embody some sort of renewed promise in the universality of international law. Further constructive trends are the strategic mobilization of counter-norms or counter-regimes. For example, the WTO multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement concluded by a group of members of the World Trade Organization after the petering out or obstruction of the dispute settlement body appellate body by the USA. And not only on the nation-state level, but also inside and beyond states, a range of actors work in favor of international law. For example, domestic courts and parliaments can resist states' withdrawals from treaties and from international organizations. The South Africa High Court prevented South Africa from denouncing the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And another application of international law by domestic courts is, of course, the very widespread climate action before domestic courts. And moreover, cities all around the world claim themselves to be international law friendly. For example, they apply the Paris Agreement even against their national government, or they harbor undocumented migrants as sanctuary cities. And also, big transnational corporations resist backscaling. For example, the European CEO alliance of 8 big companies, including Volkswagen, has publicly urged the European Union to stick to the Green Deal. Of course, this is also a form of blue washing, but because it also follows the market logic, it's also serious. So business can contribute to the resilience of international law. So the question is now, what's new in all this turmoil? Big powers have always evaded and undermined international law. Oligarchy and hegemony have been perennial features of international order. Nationalism and protectionism and the lack of solidarity is nothing new. Corporate capture is nothing new. I would nevertheless say that, despite some déjà vu, I see at least 3 contextual facts that add new variations to the old song of hegemony. And this has also an impact on the international legal order. So first of all, we have relatively new challenges, material challenges. The digital revolution has bright sides, but it also promotes disinformation and manipulation. Crisis is serious, mass extinction is underway. Identities, nationalism, and extractivism are ideas which now lead us even to Mars, maybe, after the Earth's resources are being depleted. And Westphalian challenges resurface. The power shift away from the West is ongoing. The scramble for resources is tough. And there are also what I would call globalization challenges, such as business mobility and transnational supply chains that create a high interdependence of the states. All these facts and their implications are, of course, not plain and obvious. They always need to be interpreted, and they need framing, and shifting of frame matters. It leads to different approaches and outcomes when the climate crisis is tackled in the frame of environmental law or in the frame of decolonization. And now, of course, the US presidency has created a completely new political context. The master himself dismantles the house he built. And the unraveling of what has been called the American global order, although it has already for several years, but this unraveling had been done by others, especially by rising states of the global south, China and Russia. And the new thing is now that the US, a traditionally democratic and liberal state, itself continues the job. The second new feature of the current constellation is that when the house is being torn down, allies such as Europe and Canada might be buried under the rubbles. And third, big tech, especially digital big tech, is concentrated in the US, and the US dominance can, of course, be used against enemies, but also against political allies, which are economic competitors. So these events, I think, and the changed context do matter for the international legal order, and here I don't want to speak of decay or backlash, but I wish to characterize the developments more with a neutral term, shift of order, or change of order. So I try a snapshot now. I think it is not just stripping off the layers of cooperation, constitutionalization, and global governance back to what has been called the international law of coexistence. I think that the recent events have overtaken that analysis because the Russian invasion into Ukraine, Trump's announcements of annexing Canada, Greenland, and Panama, and so on, and Gaza Riviera, also discard classic principles, key principles of the classic international law of coexistence, state sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-use of force, and so on. We are secondly not reverting to an interstate order of closed sovereign nation states because the states are too entangled, as I said, dependent amongst each other and on business actors. Civil society actors will continue to play a role. Indigenous groups are powerfully rising. So the new international order will not be a shift back to Westphalia or Eastphalia. Are we heading towards a concert of powers for the global era? This seems unlikely. A vision would be important as an element of soft power. Despite the reappreciation of military hard power, the importance of soft power can only grow in the age of social media. The discursive power to create a master narrative is all important, as we see with regard to Gaza. And neither Russia nor the US nor China alone are able to dominate the rest of the world in this sphere of soft power. And due to their lack of a common vision, a vision of how the global order should look like, they're not concerted, but they are divided. Finally, the so-called decline of the Western-shaped international order is also not so convincing because it has not been entirely Western legal order to begin with, despite dominance of the Europe and later the US, because many other regions have constantly contributed legal ideas that are now an integral part of this order. Inge van Hulle has masterfully shown how Africa in the 19th century was foundational to structural global legal developments. And in the 20th century, ideas like truth and reconciliation commissions, rights of nature, all have come from the peripheries. And therefore, because international law has never been an entirely Western construct, its potential de-Westernization is also less dramatic than it might look at first sight. And of course, now Trump's maneuvers have demonstrated, if anything, a stark divide, not only of interests, but also of normative attitudes between the US and Europe. So overall, I think it's more a divided West than a decline of the West. So where does international legal order go? I think that the following features, even if only in degree, are more relevant to characterize the emerging international legal order. The Trumpish obsession with deals is exactly the buzzword for a scheme of horizontal and most of all bilateral agreements, a move away from, so to speak, vertical institutionalization, so establishment of bodies over and above states. Secondly, a move away from multilateralism. And thirdly, and importantly, a move away from cooperation towards a shared objective, such as climate mitigation. Of course, this is also not entirely new. China has for decades been insisting on bilateral negotiations as opposed to subjecting itself to arbitration. But these prior trends have been dramatically intensified now and accelerated. And there is also a new or renewed confusion between sovereignty and jurisdiction, imperium on the one side, and property, dominium on the other side, through the revival of the idea of purchase and lease of, let's say, Greenland and Gaza. So altogether, this might lead to a revival of international law that is a private law writ large, as it has been described 100 years ago, which smacks of ruthless global capitalism and unfettered global competition. And although I said that the world will not revert to Westphalia, and that the three big powers cannot do it alone, that of course does not preclude that geopolitics plays a huge role. Zelensky himself reminded Trump in the famous encounter that there is a nice big ocean between the US and Europe and Russia, and that this makes all the difference. So geographic spheres of interest are in the process of being carved out. The idea of a new balance of powers floating around, with Trump obviously seeking to drive a wedge between China and Russia and not unhappy to divide the European Union. These strategies do not in themselves change anything in international law, but they have the potential to weaken the principles, such as the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and territorial integrity, because these principles will be bent in order to safeguard the powerful state's interests. Third, the international order is becoming likely less liberal as a shorthand for democracy and market economy, and more authoritarian. Already in 2019, Putin had said that liberalism is obsolete. And when President Trump now proclaims that he who saves his country does not violate any law, he not only invents an emergency that would warrant exceptional emergency powers, but raises himself above the law and thus negates the rule of law. As Kim Lane Shepele has warned, the US is now clearly on an autocratic path paved by law. And when the US is becoming more like an authoritarian regime like the other great powers, then this will inevitably strengthen the authoritarian elements in international law. To conclude, we're in a relatively new situation which seems to demand new legal responses. But the three fundamental shocks I mentioned at the beginning pose different types of problems. The Russian invasion is a systemic issue because Russia declared the war to be a war against the entire West. Here, the legal standard is quite clear. It is blatantly a violation of the prohibition of aggression, but it cannot be enforced because Russia has a veto in the Security Council, and the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction for the crime of aggression against the Russian leader's troika. The problem of Gaza, and generally the Israeli-Palestine situation, here the international legal situation is, I would say, much more complex. This is not a black and white situation. Moreover, the legal standards of international humanitarian law are abysmally low. Many horrible things can be lawfully committed under the mantle of military necessity. So here we have the problem that not only international law is hardly enforceable, but also that international law itself is not good enough in substance in the first place. And third, we have the situation of Trump, who now simply sidelines international law. So especially now, I really have doubts about the value of my endeavors. Should scholars simply suspend the desire to change the world? That was a recent proposal in the Leiden Journal of International Law. For me, that's not an option. But the question is whether the law can help changing the world. Especially in the last 30 years or so, many scholars of international law have very intensely, and rightly so, worked on exposing the dark sides of international law. But this then often leads to a legal nihilism. However, I think that opting out of the legal arena in the struggle for peace and justice is not really possible, because in a way we cannot escape the law anyway. Law, also international law, is present in so many spheres which are only seemingly unregulated. For example, the ruthless exploitation of nature and its animals is facilitated and condoned by the legal institutions of property and sovereignty over natural resources. So these institutions are already legally coded and constituted, and therefore legal reform, prepared maybe by scholarly argument, seems a necessary condition for combating injustice. And this insight might motivate us, students and practitioners of the law, not to leave this turf to others, but try to espouse a critical attitude that still allows to make law a force for the good. And in order to do this, and this is my third point, we need to understand the workings of the law from the inside. However, a critique that remains fully inside the doctrinal workings of the law has no teeth. On the other hand, a critique of the law relying only on some external benchmark of morality or political ideology, be it rational choice or post-colonialism, is to some extent random. Also, the claim that international law is inevitably nothing but ideology, a silk glove that camouflages the iron fist of power, coupled with the suspicion that expert knowledge production inevitably amounts to epistemic violence, this attitude makes us international lawyers defenseless against what's just happening. I think that certain intellectual trends have, however unwittingly, contributed to the possibility that today there is a profound skepticism against science and scholarly knowledge production, that there is a disdain for facts and a normative posture of anything goes. And this is now being exploited and abused by criminal political leaders. Therefore, international legal scholarship should not allow international law to become a mere plaything, neither of powerful politicians nor of critical movements. For example, it's important to point out that the security resolution that I just mentioned, which does not name the Russian aggression, this resolution conveys the message that the category of lawful versus unlawful use of force is not relevant for resolving the conflict. This silence might be useful for creating peace and order right now, but it will not be a just peace, and it therefore will not be sustainable unless, maybe in a later stage, additional steps of transitional justice towards truth, reconciliation, and possibly reparation will be taken. The silence of the Security Council leads to the fourth point. The checking out from international law is the most important danger for the international legal order as a whole. And therefore, we must bring as many people as possible to speak about international law and bring in the legal perspective as one of many perspectives in discussions about Gaza or Greenland and tariffs. Of course, international law is often invoked by the hegemons in order to cloak their privilege. But even if that rhetoric is to a large extent a sham, disguising the true realities of power, international law is not only a disguise of power, but it's at the same time, as I said, also constitutive of power, and it can be a check on it. And if only through the discursive entanglement and the argumentative self-entrapment. Because even the cynic allows others to formulate their criticism in the form of legal arguments. And that means when not even the claim that the law serves the public good is upheld, however biased or hypocritical that claim may be, then there is no reason at all for citizens of other states to obey the law at all. So a world without any appeal to international law, however hypocritical those appeals may be, is worse than a world with international law. Along these lines, we should effectively measure international law and its applications against benchmarks that are already present in international law itself and that can be renewed. And thereby, we can trigger transformations from within the law in order to pinpoint the contradiction between the legal order and the requirements of global justice, and thereby mitigate the violence of the law. For example, humanism, as championed by Erasmus, who also advised the creation of a college here in Leuven, can be distinguished from anthropocentrism, and it could be reconceptualized as an embedded and a more than human humanism. The aspiration for universality, without which international law does not deserve its name, can and I think needs to be reactivated in full recognition that universality has and been invoked by the hegemons as a mode of power. But if we investigate based on anthropological research and surveys about what people on the ground want, what they think, what they feel, then I think we can identify general universal norms in what our Japanese colleague Onuma called a trans-civilizational approach. To conclude, we are in the middle of turmoil of world order, but whether we are in a Grotian moment is an open question. Time will tell. Such watershed and crystallizing moments for international law are called after the so-called founding father, Hugo Grotius, who actually received much inspiration from the Jesuit and natural law authority Leonardus Lessius from the Jesuit college here. And therefore, I suggest that you as students and scholars of the University of Leuven can celebrate both the 600-year anniversary of your university and the 400th anniversary of Hugo de Grotius' seminal work of international law, De Jure Belli Ac Pacis, the law of war and peace. Thank you.
Dear colleague, dear Anna, I think I speak in the name of most of us if I say that we met here today a truly remarkable person, a remarkably strong person, and I'm not only referring to this formal session, but also to the fireside chat you had during 1 hour and a half before. It must be an exhaustive day for you. You said so many wise things, wise words, without perhaps always realizing how much you impressed your audience. I confess I took notes of many things. Personal notes, purely subjective, but I would like to give some examples also to those who were not present during that fireside chat. First, there was your plea for legal craftsmanship, and you repeated it here. Speak the language of the law. That is something we absolutely share at this faculty. Just as your plea against too much specialization, in order to see links between different fields, you have to be aware of different fields. I also noted down a statement you made. Harmony in itself is not a goal of international law or of law, because we can all very harmoniously go wrong. So it is something to remember. We also appreciated very much that you voice concerns, doubts about your own discipline, very strong doubts sometimes. At the same time, you push back, you are resilient, and that has also shown here in your lecture. And then there was that fantastic answer to the last question of Professor Van Hulle during the fireside chat. Professor Van Hulle, intelligent as she is, said, I'm not going to ask you the obvious thing. Can you please give some good advice to our young researchers? I'm going to ask you the opposite. Can you give us a piece of absolutely bad advice? What's the worst advice you could give to young researchers? And your answer on the spot was networking. Who dares to say that? If we would say it, nobody would believe it. It takes a doctor honoris causa to give us that true, very, very true statement. I think it's a wonderful quote to end this session. I would like to thank the Desquin Quartet very much. I would like to thank all of you present here. We are not all international law lawyers, but we are all here to support the values that you stand for and that you fight for. Thank you very much for being here. And yes, we will now have a reception, not for networking, because networking always has the connotation, I want to get something out of you and you want to get something out of me. That's not why we will have the reception. We will have the reception out of genuine interest for each other and out of friendship. This session is now adjourned. Thank you.